World Localization Day up and running, and it's very exciting. We hope to be able to reach many more people than we've been able to reach so far with this clear sort of vision, a sort of set of lenses through which you can see that really most of our problems have to do with our economic system. But it's a system that's become so big that most people are not realizing that it's an economic system that's creating so many problems, including what we're going to talk about tonight, epidemics of depression and anxiety. They're linked to the economic system, but these days that system is so vast, it's so global, it's so distant, so people just think of it as life itself. They think of themselves as not being good enough. They blame themselves. And so for me, this is one of my biggest motivations in trying for many years to get people to look at the economic system. Because once we do, getting over that self-blame and realizing that actually changing a few economic policies is a lot easier than changing life itself. So that's really, the essence of our message. And on World Localization Day, we've got some very prominent people involved who will be joining us, like Noam Chomsky, Brian Eno. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's been described as one of the greatest musicians after the Beatles. Vandana Shiva, you may have heard of many, many people. And really importantly also, we'll be hearing from voices from around the world, from Asia, Africa, and South America, many voices you wouldn't have heard of before, really trying to put on the map that there is this set of lenses, there is this way of understanding what's going on in the world, and there are examples on the ground, practical examples that demonstrate the multiple benefits of localizing. So please help to get the word out about that and stay tuned for that. And like I said, one of the main reasons why this is so important for us and so urgent is that not only is there this epidemic of depression and anxiety that is literally worldwide, but there's also just a sense of despair about human nature. So there are many people who don't necessarily suffer from anxiety or depression in that sort of clinical way, but they feel genuinely just they've lost hope, they've lost faith in human nature. And that's maybe more in my generation, that I have quite a few friends who now are sort of saying, well, the human race is just so stupid, so greedy. Look what we're doing to the living world. Look what we're doing to animals. We deserve to extinguish ourselves. So this thinking, from our point of view, is entirely a function of not having seen that what we call the economy is actually something much, much bigger and something much more influential than we think. But the only reason it's so influential is that we're not looking at it. It doesn't have real power in and of itself. And that's what's so good about looking at it and understanding, what is this thing? What is the economic system actually? Who creates the money? How is the money distributed? How can it be that all around the world, which again, most people don't know, but the truth is that all around the world, a product that comes from 10,000 miles away will cost less than a product that comes from 1 mile away. How is that possible? What's been going on? How can it be that countries are importing and exporting the same product? And we're talking about climate change. How could anyone justify shipping milk and beef and water back and forth across the entire globe while we all discuss the problem with carbon and climate changing emissions of different kinds? The reason this is going on from our point of view is that very, very few people have actually been stepping back to look at the global economic system from a global perspective and looking at it also from a grounded perspective, so that you're actually observing the changes on the land. What's happened to farmers? What's happened to people? Why do we have such intense pressures to move into the big city, to look for a job, and to have 10,000 university graduates applying as cleaners in India? Why is this happening? How? So, I mean, we have answers to this, and it really is because from starting already in the mid-70s, I ended up in this remote part of the world called Ladakh, or Little Tibet, and later on also worked in Bhutan. And Bhutan you've probably heard about, it's a small kingdom in the Himalayas. And in both Ladakh and Bhutan, I met people who were the happiest, the most relaxed, the most vital also. They weren't just happy and relaxed, they were so vital, they were so energetic, they were so full of humor. So I was amazed. I had arrived as part of the film team. I was only going to spend 6 weeks to help make a film. And I was a linguist. They had wanted me to come to this remote part of Tibet that belongs politically to India, as it had just been opened up to the outside world. And they knew that, it had been so cut off for generations. They wanted me to try to pick up a bit of the language and to help make the film. And, virtually the minute I arrived, I had fallen in love with these people. And so when the filming was finished, I ended up staying. I ended up starting projects, working with local people to demonstrate an alternative to conventional development based on decentralized renewable energy, based on trying to raise awareness about why their organic, traditional ways of farming were actually very progressive. But what was happening was that the local people were suddenly told that they were backward and primitive, and they should use these new modern chemicals like they do in America and in Europe. They weren't told that actually those chemicals had been outlawed already in Europe and America. They included DDT and other outlawed pesticides. So there was a lot of work to do to bridge the information gap. And that's basically what our work has consisted of now for almost 45 years. And we see this enormous need for that information gap being filled by more reliable, grounded information. It includes the fact that anxiety, depression, and suicide among young people in England is not an English phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon now. And that we've seen very clearly that in cultures where suicide essentially didn't exist, in places like Ladakh and Bhutan, where there might have been a suicide in a generation, but now it's about one a month, and it's young people. So what is happening? Why is this going on? So again, it was really, my eyes were open to this enormous shift that economic development, growth creates. And the difficulty is that to question it as broadly as we do, as broadly and as deeply, you really have to go back hundreds of years in many parts of the world. Because really in India and much of Africa and South America, and even in the United States itself, the beginnings of this modern economic system were really based on genocide, slavery, and later colonialism. So it's been a process of the big wealthy traders, essentially through force, being able to drive people away from producing for themselves, to go on to cotton plantations or giant other monocultures to produce for the big traders. And we don't realize that deeply embedded in the modern economy is a principle called comparative advantage, which basically says, no, in any part of the world where people are producing for themselves as a priority, we call that subsistence, and we just write it off as hardship and horror and poverty and struggle and ignorance, stupidity, uneducated, primitive, tribal. Our history doesn't allow us to actually look at what some pre-industrial, pre-colonial, pre-slavery cultures might have looked like. And they weren't all perfect, they weren't all paradise. But it is really quite important that we re-examine some very basic assumptions about the economy. But to move forward, fast forward, I want to say that really the most urgent and important thing right now is that we pay some attention to what's happened to the economy in the last 30 years. And in the last 30 years, there have been these enormous changes based on basically continuing what I said before, with its deep roots in destroying production for home needs to force people to produce larger and larger monocultures for export. That process goes back a very long time. After the Second World War, it was given a bigger push because governments, political leaders, many idealistic people thought that we have to avoid another world war, we have to avoid another depression, and the way to do that is to increase the pressure for economies to become interlinked through trade. And so instead of realizing that a lot of the issues that led to both the world wars had to do with the economy, had to do with rape and pillage of resources, had to do with battles over oil, battles over resources in this trade-based economy where the giants had more and more power. Instead of realizing that, there was a big push to go even further. And so the World Bank, the IMF, and this general agreement on tariffs and trade was set up. And this process of pushing governments to become more and more dependent on global trade accelerated. Now, in about the mid-80s, the global businesses and banks that had benefited so much from this rolling out of a red carpet for them after the Second World War, these giants were very influential in essentially shaping the economy, and they were pushing governments to go even further, to give them more freedom. And they called it free trade, they called it globalization. Most of the people who worked in those businesses, in those giants, even the CEOs, were not being made to understand that there was something fundamentally wrong here, that it was actually incredibly wasteful of energy, of resources, that it was very damaging to most populations, to all really, and that there were very few winners, fewer and fewer. They weren't being forced to look at that because the idea had been, we need more of this, let's speed it up, let's scale it up. And so they were given this red carpet. And so since the mid-80s, this acceleration is what has led to most people recognizing that the world has been getting worse and worse in these last 30 years. Most analysts, most people looking at human rights, at the gap between rich and poor, at ecocide, extinction of species, at social unrest, at fundamentalism, most people are absolutely aware that things have been getting a lot worse in the last 30 years. Most people are not aware that it's happening in every country, that the trend in every country has been in that direction. Most people are also not aware that forever and accelerating with this globalizing path at the grassroots, there have been micro trends where people are waking up to the fact that They don't want to be locked into a rat race where they've got to go rushing off to bigger and bigger cities to compete harder and harder for fewer and fewer jobs. People have started choosing quality of life over the competitive rat race. There are very clear trends in virtually every country that people who can are trying to step up. There was sort of expressions like "stop the world, I want to get off." Well, now in a way with COVID, there's been a stop, and we are seeing a lot of people saying, "Oh, I actually quite like this. I quite like having a bit more time to reflect, to think, to slow down a bit." There are many people who are, of course, very frightened because their economic survival looks completely threatened. And we just hope that some of those of you who feel that way are listening, and that you will put your power and your energy into helping us to get out the word about the fact that changing the direction of the economy away from more and more dependence on a very fragile global market towards strengthening local economies worldwide, from Timbuktu to Tibet to Taiwan, with nice teas there. In all of those places, strengthening local economies would benefit the majority of people. And once you understand that from a global point of view, you'll be able to withstand the propaganda that tries to tell you that, oh, this idea of strengthening the local or even the national economy is somehow nationalist or xenophobic. It's very right wing. This is absolutely not true. What we really need to recognize is that, first of all, around the world, people are demonstrating that they actually want to live in a way that is not quite so competitive, not so fast-paced, not so far removed from nature, from the animals, from the plants, from the living world, not so cut off from other people. We actually long for connection, and there's a lot of evidence for that. The most important evidence that we try to highlight is not only that many traditional cultures like Ladakh and Bhutan more or less didn't have suicide. And in fact, when I used to tell them about depression in the West, people really couldn't understand. I would tell them, actually on television and in the media images and even in your school books, it looks like in the modern urban world, especially a place like New York, it's a type of paradise. People have everything you would want. They don't have to work. They've got so much money. They're so powerful. They're so glamorous. They're so beautiful. I would tell them, actually, the truth is that in America, in New York itself, a very large number of people suffer from depression. And what that means is that they have a type of inner, spiritual, mental, psychological illness. So there are actually doctors who deal with that inner psychological, spiritual illness. And they often, in the beginning, they didn't believe me. They thought I must be making this up. They couldn't understand what that was. So we can learn from looking at the evidence, and it's particularly extreme with indigenous people. All around the world, you will see records of people who never showed signs of any of these extreme psychological problems, and you will find very shortly after being forced into Western schooling, forced into a Western industrial path, epidemics of drug addiction, alcoholism, violence, every sign that things are not going well. But we also want to present to people the evidence that we see that in a very graphic way, once we open our eyes, we put on different lenses, shows that in the West as well, right now, in contemporary New York or London or Paris, people who are broken, who have severe drug addiction, sex addiction, have are alcoholic, are deeply depressed. The remedies, the solutions, the therapies that work, that really work in the long run, have to do with building connection, community, deep human connection, and connection to nature. And we're talking about an awakening to the spiritual oneness, the web of life, the sense of feeling a part of it, being in the flow of connections, of relationships, not feeling cut off, isolated, fearful, self-conscious. For most of us in the West, one of the easiest ways to tread in that direction of connection is through connecting to animals, to nature, to plants, because we've been so trained to be self-conscious, to be to try to be impressive, to try to be important, to try to be clever, to try to be beautiful, essentially to try to be some kind of perfection that has been pushed on us through media and through ideas in schooling, at every level, from the earliest age. So it's harder for us to connect deeply to other people, but it's vitally important. And the key tool is the understanding of the need to be willing to be vulnerable, meaning the willingness to show I'm not perfect. I have my doubts, I have depression, I have addiction, I'm not perfect. I'm human. We don't realize how much of our communication, starting with kindergarten, where we have this industrial factory farming of children, where we segregate them into separate age groups. So literally the universe becomes elbows. They can't help each other. They're neither physically nor emotionally able to reach out a hand and help the other. So it becomes a life of elbows and competition. And that's how we're breeding our children all the way through their youth, segregated artificially into separate age groups. Now, I know that for many of you living in the West, maybe you think that it's not possible to change this, so there's no point thinking about it. But I know of many cases where people become more alert to this, and even though their children might be going to school, segregated into separate age groups, they will make an attempt, they'll make an effort to encourage a deeper connection across ages. They will understand the importance of several significant others in the life of the child. They will understand that the combination of the nuclear family and this factory farming in schools is so destructive. So they'll make an attempt to move out of that. And it is happening. And the therapies that do this very consciously, like Alcoholics Anonymous, that is proven to be, deeply effective, is about that deep connection to others. You're on a journey with others. You're sharing, you're communicating, you become part of a we instead of an I. And that is also linked in Alcoholics Anonymous to a spiritual awakening. It's quite Christian, but it's very much a reminder of that life, and the web of life is something that is bigger than what we experience when we feel shut off and frightened and cut off. So I think that the most important thing that I can say about all of this is that it may sound extremely simplistic, to talk about connection again and again, connection to others, connection to nature, connection to animals and plants. But what I need to add that many people are not talking about, because what I'm saying about connection and connecting to nature and to others is something that's fairly widespread knowledge now. But we feel that there's not enough emphasis on the structural path, on how we could actually change our way of life so that how we live our lives, what we spend our time on, how we earn our living, how our cities are designed, how education is designed. All of these things are affected by a few economic policies that we're not paying attention to. But once we do, once we wake up to how fundamentally important changing the economy is, then we'll start seeing that there is this new economy movement. First of all, there's in almost every country in every country we know of, there is now the emergence of a new economy movement. More and more environmentalists, social activists, people concerned about everything from poverty, unemployment, justice, peace, the rights of women, indigenous people, dolphins, trees, biodiversity, democracy, virtually every issue you care to mention. There are people now beginning to see that we can link together, not to become one organization or one mega global organism, but we can share a big picture so that our voices can unite in this demand to shift the direction of the economy. So for us, this is the big hope, is that this will happen over the next 4, 5, 6 years, that COVID has led to a deep and broad and deeply, a deep psychological rethink. Many people have had to face their mortality. Many people have been also very confused about this sort of post-truth world. There's been a lot of rethinking going on, and there's been a bit of time to reflect. And we are really hoping, to add to that, and to add with a sort of clarity that it's just a fact that the dominant economic system in every part of the world is widening the gap between rich and poor in a way that is simply obscene. And I'm saying that includes my native country of Sweden. The direction changes because of the pressures of the global economy. In terms of the mainstream changes are very, very clearly destructive. Now, we at Local Futures, as part of the new economy movement, we are convinced that the way to speedily head in a healthy way that will be so healing for the individual, for us who feel depressed or given up on mankind or humankind, is to clearly support localization. Because what we're saying is that right now, you can actually reach out wherever you live. Almost certainly you will find the seeds of localized initiatives that represent this coming together of changing the I to a we. They represent, wonderful healing projects, even, bringing a dog into a school or into an old people's home. All of these are part of that reconnection. And they're everywhere demonstrating how vitally important it is that we reconnect to life. Well, the way to do that in a speedy way is to join the localization movement now. And you can do that by opening your eyes to what might be going on in your area. You can do it by connecting with us and finding examples of projects that if you don't find them in your area, and it can be in the heart of a big city or in a smaller town, but generally it's not out in some remote part of wilderness, even though we can regenerate our batteries there. That's not where we start building the structures, of a new culture, a new society, a new way of being, a new way of seeing ourselves and seeing life. Now that is something that's a collective endeavor. So, if you look, you'll probably find projects already to join or support. But very importantly, you can also help to get together with a few others and start taking initiative to new projects. And what we're recommending as a foundation stone of building that new world is to reconnect with food and farming. It's far, far more important than most people realize. It is far more fundamental part of how we've gone wrong for a long time, because we've been pushed by those big traders, not evil people. Although I have to say, in the early days, some of the slave owners didn't have very nice values. But today, many of the CEOs of big corporations have very good values. They're just not being forced to look at how the scale of their businesses and the way they're shaped through a financial casino, and how there's enormous pressure on every CEO in a publicly traded corporation to see the bottom line as the most important thing. Even though they might add a few green and a few social additions, it's a structure that's a disaster. But anyway, what we can do now is both join and support localization initiatives and hopefully become a big picture activist, so that you help to get the word out, even if it's just to friends who are desperately depressed and who are blaming themselves and who don't know that their depression, their anxiety, their frustration in being pushed in a far too intense way in the wrong direction at university, even in school, and now, forced to look for meaningless work in some giant city where the house prices are so high that you often have to spend 3 hours commuting a day, sometimes more than that. This is inhuman. It is entirely a question of what we as a society choose to support in terms of an economic direction. It's got nothing to do with overpopulation. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Overpopulation is a problem, but overpopulation is not what's creating scarce jobs and unemployment. What's creating unemployment is that our governments, left and right, have been wedded to an economic path which systematically destroys jobs and pushes businesses through taxes, subsidies, and regulations to use more and more energy, more and more resources, more and more of the scarce natural resources to dump people, to replace them with techno systems and with ways of doing things where people become redundant. Now, on a crowded planet, overpopulated, we're overpopulated vis-a-vis natural resources. We're not overpopulated vis-a-vis jobs, but because we have this mad economic system, the renewable resource that could be used to heal the earth, we now actually, because we've used fossil fuels and toxic chemicals that came out of the war machine, the chemicals used for chemical fertilizer, for pesticide, came out of the war machine. They've been applied to the land. They've poisoned the land. They killed the land. And now, what do we want to do? We say that because we have so many people to feed, to feed the world, we must go to genetic engineering. We must have robots do the farming, because it's become so large scale and so boring and so horrible that no one wants to farm. Well, actually, if we don't wake up to this issue very soon, we are going over the cliff. So we really need to wake up to how fundamentally important this wake up is around food and farming. We will see also when we talk about mental health and well-being that one of the most widespread, most beautiful healing processes is when people connect in that meaningful, productive way to the earth. From little children to older people, many of whom have never farmed. And look, after COVID now, how many people are actually buying the seeds and the seedlings and beginning to enjoy that? We're not suggesting that the new economy will mean that everyone will be a farmer, but we are suggesting that it should be a human right across the world for a child to learn how to grow things from seed, to learn how to tend the soil, to feel that amazing joy of actually being a productive part of nature, but a humble and connected part where we realize that we're not in control. We're dealing with this mystery. We don't know why the two plants we plant next to each other, why is one twice as big in a short time? And they were planted, near each other. They were given the same amount of water. They look like they have the same amount of sun. The miracle of life, constant change, constant and just infinite complexity. This is the lesson for every child, for every human being, to really start in practice and in reality to understand all this language about complexity and systems theory. A lot of that language is going on in remote academic institutions, is completely out of touch with the living world, which is why many of those voices are promoting genetic engineering, artificial food, farming with robots. We desperately need people who still have more of their bodily senses in touch and who have still been in touch enough with life to just intuitively reject that nonsense and really embrace a healing, deep path that, broadly speaking, we're calling localization, and we're seeing, fundamental to that is this reconnection to life. And to come back again to food and farming, we think it should be a human right for every child to have that experience. And the wonderful thing is that as part of the localization movement, we could take you to schools in the middle of Seoul, Korea, in the middle of Beijing. We can show you that this is happening, but it's small, it's not in the media, but it's there, it's everywhere. Because people at some intuitive, deep level long for that connection. So this needs, however, to be given a much bigger voice. It needs to multiply, not grow into bigger and bigger projects, but multiply. And this, as I say, should be a human right for every child. It should also be considered a human right that we should be working for an economy where every single group and human being has a right to fresh food from relatively nearby. The processed, transported foods, even when they're supposedly fresh, we know what happens. As part of that supermarket giant culture and economy, the tomatoes are picked while they're green, they're gassed, bananas, the same thing. 2 apples, 2 bananas can be completely different realities when it comes down to the actual micronutrients, the nutrition, what our bodies need. And bringing the food economy closer to home is absolutely essential. Now that's a foundation stone of the localization movement, and it's a foundation stone to heal the earth, to heal us, in a really profound way. And that doesn't mean that localization as a general economic trend means that every single thing we use should come from a mile away or any absolute. It's a process of shortening. Industries producing technological products, whatever might be real needs. And of course, we're talking about refrigerators and transport and so on. That does not include built-in obsolescence. We're talking about rethinking the economy, from the bottom up and looking at what are the real human needs. How can we make products that have a long life so that we use those scarce minerals in a way that doesn't mean that you have to throw them away after just a couple of years, just when the warranty runs out. the economic trajectory right now, as we all know, has been in a worse and worse direction in that way. As we rethink the economy, we're not talking about localizing, down to some tiny village level. We're not saying that with industry, that there isn't an efficiency of scale, that bigger can be more efficient. When it comes to fishery, farming, and forestry, the efficiency of scale is actually the smaller the better, the more people the better. Why can't we afford those people? Because of an economic system that subsidizes the energy and the technology. So I won't bore you too much with economics, but it is important that you help us both to look at some of those basic, simple building blocks of the modern economy, and that you start questioning them, and that you start supporting these new local initiatives. I also want to say that it really is important to stress that local in another way means place, so we're talking about place-based businesses and place-based economies. So for us, what that means is that every business, even a large industry, should belong to a place. And at the moment, we've got, the nation state as a unit that could provide democracy. In most cases right now, we don't have that, because we're having big financial forces and pressures shaping policy without discussing those with the voter. And on both left and right, we've been following in the same direction. So, and remember again, the same direction has meant everywhere, widening the gap between rich and poor, using more and more resources on a crowded planet with scarce resources. So those two fundamentals have to change. And part of the way to do that is to insist that people have the right to vote on these issues, that people have a right to know how unemployment is created, how money is created, who's actually creating it, who's running the show. Until now, it's been the big banks telling governments what to do. So we often think the Bank of England would actually be of England, but no, it's England that belongs to the bank rather than the other way around. There's just a few basic principles there that lead us to use localization as a path that doesn't only involve the very local, the food, the farming, and the fisheries at a very local level. It also is about industry. And we're saying that the banks and the big businesses need to register in a particular country. They can no longer say to government, bye-bye, I'm going off to Japan. If you don't do as I say, I'll go somewhere else. That's what happened with the banks after 2008. That should not be allowed. In other words, businesses need to be place-based, even when they're big industries. They can import resources, they can collaborate with other businesses, but it is this need for new trade treaties where we, the citizens, have a role in voicing our social and ecological priorities to shape business. So the basic rules for business, the basic playing field, will be determined through democratic process. If we allow multinationals to stay multinational, in other words, placeless, non-localized, globalized, if we do that, we have no way of having a democratic process determine their rules unless we try to start a global government. Now, I hope most of you would agree that global government would be something extremely difficult for the voter to feel connected to and to feel that they have any power over. No, we are saying the nation state right now could offer the potential for genuine democracy. In the long run, in many countries, there might be breakaway strategies, like Scotland right now in the UK. That's that's possible. But for right now, the important thing is not to break away, but to come together. So we need international collaboration from the grassroots, from at every level. We're very happy to be collaborating also with mayors from different countries and trying to create as much communication as possible, because we need very, very badly more international information exchange and collaboration at every level. And we want to encourage our governments to get back around the same tables where they negotiated trade treaties that gave global, mobile, placeless, unlocalized businesses the right to tell government what to do. Now we want to say no. Governments, and we are going to be looking from the social and environmental movements. We want to be at the table. We want to know the truth, and we want new treaties. So I hope that you all don't think that that's too big an ask, an ask, and that it sounds too not doable. I know many of you might, but I'm hoping that the combination of what we're urging you to think about, the combination of right now trying to link with local initiatives, and I said, you know, the foundation stone is food, but there are very many projects that also include local community energy, local finance, actually wonderful schemes where people come together and realize the multiple benefits for the whole community to take control of the money flow as well. There are business alliances, there are changes to education, there are all kinds of wonderful examples of community building and therapy that is based on reconnection. So there's a wealth of projects and initiatives that are truly inspiring and vitally important. Whatever happens to policy, which I pray will change, but that won't happen overnight. You could almost overnight be inspired by and feel strengthened and renewed by connection to the local initiatives and supporting them. And that is absolutely essential. Whatever happens in the long run, we have to rebuild those basic cornerstones. So whatever you do in that way, you'll be helping something that we can almost promise will be personally healing as well as helping to heal the planet. So it really is a win-win strategy, and I hope you're going to join us. And don't forget about World Localization Day on June 21st. And the most important thing you could do would be to help us get the word out about it in the meanwhile. We want to get lots of people there. I would like now to ask Laura and our colleague Henry. They are the two youngest members of Local Futures, and they have been, I'm just thrilled to be working with such wonderful young people, and both of them are, as you'll see, exceptional people, and they both had, they both had enough personal experience of what's going on in the world, and of course been working with us. So I think they have a very important contribution to make to this issue of well-being and happiness. So Laura, do you want to start? And Henry, are you there? Can we see both of you?
Hey, yeah, we're here.
Good. So Laura, do you want to start?
Sure. I guess it's tricky to follow on from that because you cover so much in such a eye-opening way. But yeah, I'm based in Bristol in the UK, and I'm 25, and I feel like I speak for most people. Well, definitely in the UK, I'm always interested to hear what it's like in other parts of the world when I say that my early 20s and teenage years have been very much shaped by this epidemic of depression and anxiety and suicide among young people, which has pretty much transformed a generation into, asking, what is the solution here and searching for the solution. And obviously working with Local Futures, we've spent so much time looking at the kind of systemic root causes of so many things. And I just find from our generation now who are looking for these solutions, they're kind of trapped and paralyzed by this kind of the main, especially in the UK, the main government message or kind of health message is that the mental health epidemic and mental depression and anxiety is increasing so fast because there's such a huge stigma behind it. Kind of shifting the blame from what is more of a systemic problem onto the individual. So you can then kind of, I can see how that then is almost fueling more depression and anxiety in itself, because people just, we live in a society that is completely inadequate when it comes to supporting our well-being, but we're being told that that's not the case, and if we have a problem, that it's our problem, and if we're trying to do something about that problem, we're being told, it's probably your fault because you're not talking to people enough and you're not engaging in the conversation enough and allowing people to open up, which I find terrifying, because I think I spend a lot of time trying to talk to young people about how about instead we focus on transforming the communities we live in and building connections with other people, and especially intergenerational connections, and connections that aren't just kind of our circumstantial friends, that people who've lived in other areas of the world and have a different perspective on what society should be like. But that is kind of almost laughed at in comparison to being, medicated and taking, a huge amount of drugs. And it's very scary seeing how we, because everyone is obviously very well intentioned and we all want to be doing everything we can to help this epidemic. And for most people, it's a case of helping their friends and their loved ones overcome it. And it's trying kind of opening up this message to invite them into this and say, this is something that can really help us, and show them little examples. So for me, a big part of it is trying to make sure that there is this intergenerational connection. So the young people are connecting them with older people in community events, and they're doing things on their doorsteps, and they're feeling like there is a solution out there that isn't a kind of far off spark at the end of the tunnel that they can't quite see, and they need to kind of march on the streets to get it and get governments to do it, but they can do it themselves. And like Helena was saying, then as soon as you start connecting with people and with community and building up that kind of well-being infrastructure, things really start to change. And I've seen that kind of locally where we are in Bristol. There's little pockets where community events are very strong, and there is a real neighborhood connection, and those areas you can kind of see the joy as you walk down the streets. So yeah, it's just encouraging, kind of getting that message out there to young people, because we've been raised to kind of compete against each other for university placements and jobs and this and that, and rather than saying it's not your fault that this is happening, it's a far bigger problem, but we can address that problem. That doesn't mean it needs to be, if anything, that's a sign of hope than it making it a bigger issue. So yeah, that's just a little bit of what I think here, but it's always very interesting to know around the world what the messaging is behind kind of coming from government in terms of what, how we solve this epidemic, because I find that very interesting.
Thank you, Laura. Henry, do you want to say something too?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everyone for having both of us on the call as well. And thank you, Helena. And also congratulations to Helena, who just gave us all of that information and those perspectives in a time when she herself is quite stressed, because we're organizing this World Localization Day. So I think that's pretty amazing. One of the questions here is about, is there a danger when you grow food in isolation or with people that you're not connecting with much? So say an allotment where the majority of people are retired and over 60, because you'll then even get more depressed. And it's kind of interesting that question has come up, because I very much had that experience. When I first discovered Local Futures work through the local community garden. So I joined the local community garden, and indeed it was full of retirees over 60, and I was 15 at the time. So I did initially feel that slight, that disconnection. Where are all my friends? Why can't I connect with people closer my own age? But I think the answer to that is that you do actually need more time, as any relationship does. That, you know, that first meeting, oh, we're coming up against this kind of social barrier that we're not used to crossing. It can feel alienating. But once you spend more time with those people and crucially become more interdependent, you know, that's a big word that we're always talking about, is local interdependence, the fabric of local interdependence. And that fabric is really where those relationships that don't, you know, that are really valuable and don't crumble under tension start to emerge, because you're dependent on that person that you're living nearby, or you're dependent, you know, for your daily needs, for your very survival. And that's the difference between the local economies, community-centered economies that we're talking about, and the global economy of distance and dependence that we now have. So
I also want to say, I seem to remember you telling me that when you went into that community garden, I guess after a while, that also because you were so young, you were such a special figure, and they were all so happy to see you. So you were a bit of a star and got love and attention.
That is, yeah, that's totally true.
That really does happen in a way that's particularly, you know, as you're younger, it's so important to have more of those significant others in your life, because, you know, we all want to be seen and heard and valued. It's a natural thing. And we don't realize that it's been so perverted in the modern world that now, in order to be seen and heard, we have to be globally famous. When we're globally famous, we don't feel connected to people. And that's why so many of those stars end up deeply unhappy, because we're really looking for that more human scale, real connection, where we feel that we're being appreciated for who we really are, not what we look like on the screen. But do go on, Henry. I didn't want to interrupt, but I remember
No, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that obviously plays into an analysis of social media as well, which we haven't actually talked much about on this call, but that social media being a platform where people are trying to get that recognition and being appreciated by other people. And of course it doesn't come because you're always comparing yourself to another person's highlight reel. And that's in the times, like we all know, the time when you open your phone to scroll through Instagram, that's when you're feeling bored, a bit lonely, depressed, a little bit, you know, and it actually just ends up making that worse, you know, filling your head with ideas that other people are having a better time than you are and that you're not good enough. So, you know, the cruelty of that is so tragic. But in terms of what I was saying about interdependence, there's a book called Lost Connections by Johann Hari. You might have heard of it. Johann really studied the real causes for depression. He, you know, went all around the world. He, you know, having had experience of it himself, wanted to find out the real answers because the medications were not working. So he went around the world and came up with a list that's very similar to Helena's list of the reasons, the real causes for depression and anxiety. You know, some of them are biological, he says, but the majority of them are socioeconomic. But I really recommend you read his book if you're interested in this topic. But in that book, he gives two examples of that rebuilding of local interdependence that actually start to heal people really quite dramatically. One is through therapeutic horticulture, depressed patients, patients being treated for depression were given as a kind of trial different projects that were about gardening or coming together in community in some way. And yes, at the beginning they described that experience. It was very jarring and shocking, but after time they start to really become interdependent with one another in the way that they're like, oh, you know, I care about you. I care about if you're not here today, you know, I'll give you a call or whatever. Just those small things with really good results. And you know, the preliminary studies that have been done into this are only really minor because they haven't got the funding of big pharma, because it's not a solution that can be centralized and profited from. Another example.
I also just want to say that actually, you know, in that project, the doctor who was treating them, issue was to connect with others who were having a similar problem, and then together to work out a project, and they chose the garden. So again, it was just a perfect example of both, you know, connection between people and nature that proved so effective. And as that woman said, Lisa, I think was her name, the main patient, he talks about, you know, as the garden flowered, so did they, you know, but it was this whole combination of connecting to each other and then to the garden. And I do want to say also to people that Johan will be joining us for the 21st. So he's become a colleague and a friend. So that's, yeah.
Yeah. And that his other great example was of people who had nothing to do with each other. They were in a housing allotment in Berlin, very different people, immigrants with gay people, with punks, like, yeah, all living together, all living, you know, with these walls between them and not having anything to do with each other. And then they started getting evicted from the houses because the rents were going up and they couldn't meet them. So they came together, an example of people coming together because they now rely on each other to be part of this movement to challenge that. And that, you know, he really tells that story quite beautifully of people suddenly realizing that they had so much in common with these people who they thought were so different. I think that's really beautiful. So the other thing I just wanted to add was that we see localization as, you know, all these therapies that work, the animal connection therapies, the wilderness therapies, the Alcoholics Anonymous, connecting in small groups and talking with different people. We see localization as a structural way to make those therapies not just expensive weekend therapies that are only accessible to a small percentage of the population, but a way of life for the majority. So I think that's one good way to think about localization and mental health and well-being.
Thank you, Henry. There's a question here from India that I'd like to ask, and I'd also like to say that if there aren't further questions, we might end a little early, but if you do have questions, please let us know. But so to Shalini, it's a very complicated issue, but from our perspective, and again, from Sweden to India, you know, Ladakh, where I worked for so many years, is part of India, and I'm very familiar with the changes that have been going on there, and with have colleagues, many Indian colleagues. So we have to be really careful that we don't just focus on the caste or class inequality as being the root problem. We could say that where there was this sort of injustice, say for instance, in England, when this all started, this modern economy, there were big traders that managed to push people off the land into London. And so we could say, well, you know, the root problem is this inequality. But if we do, I think we're completely missing the point about how and why in literally every culture we know of, the gap, whatever the gap was, has been growing dramatically. So for instance, let's just take Sweden again, where when I was growing up, the gap between rich and poor wasn't very big. Wasn't perfect. There were class differences, was not perfect, but we really need to arrest the process, the forces whereby this gap is being made obscenely bigger in every single culture. If we are able to do this, and if we're able to do it through international collaboration and awareness, and start taking also these initiatives towards more localized economies, what we're seeing is that it does reduce the gap. We are talking about, you know, structurally, we're talking about a handful of monopolies controlling the wealth around the world, and in so doing, operating with the giants and with the elites in all countries. So yes, very often the system will benefit the elites. But it's actually interesting that whether it's caste or class, very often the higher caste people or the high class people are also getting left behind, because it's not actually a caste or a class issue. And so in many, many cases, it's particularly true in Europe, people who might have had big land holdings and big castles and everything, they're now finding themselves so impoverished they have to turn their castles into hotels or whatever, and they can't hold on to them. So we're talking about an economic transition that will lead to greater equality. Within each country, within each place, we might want to further that, but if we don't deal with the systemic pressures that make those inequalities greater, and if we don't look at how the centralization that this economic trajectory brings about, meaning pushing more and more people into big cities looking for scarce jobs. And I have seen how this insecurity, job insecurity, from Sweden to India is leading to more fundamentalism and fear and divisiveness. Divisiveness between classes, between races, between religions, between gender is leading to a politics of identity, as people feel desperately insecure financially as well as psychologically, because all the time in this systemic centralizing path that makes fewer and fewer people richer and richer, more people are left behind. So I hope that sheds some light on your question, but it's a long story. I hope in my book, Ancient Futures, I talk about, witnessing how groups that had lived side by side for generations were killing each other very clearly because of this economic trajectory. 500 years, there had never been group conflict. I would say, to a great extent, colonialism in India ensured, by imposing this centralizing economic colonial path, the much, much greater conflicts between Buddhists, Muslims, and Hindus in that country. I think it should be possible to watch the recording. I'm just seeing some questions about that.
Yeah, we'll send the recording to you guys.
How to get social... any role for local exchange trading schemes? We do, but we have supported and been part of various schemes, also local currencies. This is now over this, sort of 40-year period. And generally what we have found is that the initiatives that actually use the national currency are working better. I need to qualify that, because what we're seeing is that for people to join a LET scheme or a local currency, it requires a huge commitment and it's quite scary. And so very often the people who commit to it are very idealistic and are willing, to go for it, but they can't pay their rent, they can't buy their food with those LET schemes or with local currency. So they don't go very far, and very often they actually are fulfilling exchanges and needs that could be met just as a community connection, massage, babysitting, and so on. What's really wonderful and surprising to us is that, having inspired and helped to start initiatives, including some local currencies, is that what really has grown are the initiatives, as I say, that involve encouraging people to come together, even using the national currency, like in farmers markets and lots of local food things, but even with local finance initiatives, financing a community energy scheme, or a multitude of things. What we're creating are the structures that in the long run could involve a local currency or a LET scheme, and particularly if things start collapsing more. But to get things going, we would recommend using the national currency for the moment. and look at the structures of getting close enough, interdependent enough, accountable enough, human scale enough, so that there's that clear reconnection into a more localized, human scale, community economy. And yes, it should be possible to watch the recording. Isn't that true, Henry? We're making it available. Scorn. So you're not Swedish, but
I think also it would be important to, if you answer a question, just to repeat what the question is, Helena, because some people can't see all of the things.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, I'm seeing someone based in Sweden asking if we know of other projects around South Sweden. We might do. We'll have to check. And if you write to us at Local Futures, we might be able to put you in touch with them.
There are a few other people saying how can.
What would also be good, I think, would be if you can tell us about your project that you're working on, that community farm, because we may not know about that, so that would be good to know about. We are trying to collect a lot, but of course it's limited, and we're a very small organization, so it's limited.
And I think, Helena, which email address should people write to you at? There are a few questions about how to...
Well, they should write to the Local Futures address.
Yeah, so that's HN8, I'll write it here in the chat, hn8@localfutures.org. I'll also put my email, so yeah, I'm not sure that there are too many other questions. There's one about...
There's one here that's about, whether we can get more information and deeper understanding of the benefits of our arguments for local economy versus globalization. My experience is that people arguing for globalization and free trade see themselves as part of creating something good. E.g., is there anywhere I can find a discussion between you and someone with the opposite opinions? Well, we're hoping to have a bit of that on World Localization Day. And you could find me on a panel at the European Union Business Forum this past summer, where I was debating, with the chief economist from the EU and someone from Unilever. And so I have had the opportunity to do that a few times, but I would love to do more. What we find is that very often the mainstream protagonists are not so keen to do that. However, in terms of what I'm saying, you will find a lot, as you say, a lot of people think that promoting globalization, particularly promoting free trade and globalization, it has been seen as almost as building global community, a sort of global village. It's been marketed in that way. And there are a lot of idealists, and in fact, particularly a lot of people on the left, who are so convinced about the need for international collaboration that they're not distinguishing between the collaboration of people who want to try to protect livelihoods, who want to try to reduce the gap between rich and poor, who want to try to work for peace and collaboration with economic giants like USBC Bank and Monsanto and Coca-Cola and Nestle having more and more power to go into economies and destroy the local businesses. Now that's what globalization and free trade treaties have facilitated. And this is a fact. I mean, this is not some kind of theory. If you actually study it, you will see it. And you will see also that inside the trade treaties are agreements, clauses called ISDS, investor-state dispute settlement, in which governments are writing in black and white, we won't do anything that might reduce your profit-making potential. If we do, you can take us to court. So that means small island states have been taken to court by Philip Morris for advertising that smoking might be harmful. It means that Canada was taken to court because they were going along with banning a toxic chemical that had been proven to be harmful to health. There are many examples. We have a Swedish nuclear power company suing Germany because Germany decided to ban nuclear power. And that meant that this nuclear power company from Sweden was able to sue them because they were not going to make the profit they had anticipated. Now, I'm absolutely convinced that if people knew the truth about what goes on behind the label, the vast majority would say, no, that's crazy. We don't want that. That can never be democracy. So it's really a question of being more informed, and I hope that you will, I hope you'll read my book, Local is Our Future, where in a very short way I try to lay out some of this and try to share it with other people. And remember, for us, this is not about good guys and bad guys. This is not about demonizing any particular company or any particular country or any particular individuals. It's really about saying, wait a minute, we haven't been seeing clearly enough these connections, which are, they're so far removed. It's like this invisible hand. And you see, in our work, we're really working with two invisible worlds. We're working with the invisible world of this economic hand, and we're working with the invisible world of our hearts, our feelings, our deeper souls. And there we're talking about what is it that makes us feel happy, joyous, feel that we have meaning, feel that we have purpose. Who are we as human beings? What are we looking for? That is an inner spiritual world, if you like. And now we're discovering that we can bring in all kinds of evidence from neuroscience that shows us that the interconnectedness between our heart, our feelings, and the biology is now being laid out more and more. And then in turn, the biome of the gut and the biome of the soil completely interconnected. We are one with the rest of life, and that connectedness is invisible to a great extent. But as I say now in modern science, there is more and more evidence of that. Now, we're trying to put this together into a cohesive picture, and so it can sound very simplistic what we're saying. But it's actually based on a lot of experience and a lot of conversations with eminent scientists, as well as with philosophers and ordinary people all over the world. So,
and I think probably the place to end would be, there are a couple of questions about something you do every day.
About Kate Rayworth.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. I know her personally, and I think it's valuable what she's doing. I am frustrated and aware that to address this particular issue of this far removed trade treaty world and what that means and how it sort of makes a joke of democracy, it sort of makes a joke of the idea that we must take the earth seriously. How on earth are we going to do that if our governments are signing treaties that make it impossible for them to do that? I have spoken to Kate about this, and I don't know whether most people shy away from it just because it feels too difficult to change, or whether it's because it feels very sensitive. I think that you do tend to get marginalized if you address this, and you don't get out so widely in the media. And I would definitely like to urge all of you to do what you can to help get this message out in a non-demonizing way, in a non-aggressive way, but just the truth that does it make sense to talk about protecting the environment while we know that this process is going on that makes it impossible to do so? And on the other hand, I feel very empowered and inspired by the fact that by going very local, we're creating the foundations that are so important and that they are showing such clear benefits. So I feel, even though it's extremely difficult and hard to raise awareness about that globalizing path, I feel that we have actually achieved quite a lot in the localization movement. That for me, every day, I get a lot of good news in my inbox that makes me feel it's all worthwhile. So I would urge you to look at, both of those levels and help to get the word out. Yeah, I can totally understand, someone who's saying, someone was asking the treaty that ISDS, yes, thank you, Laura, for putting that in. And you, Arthur, you're talking about, your financial circumstances. I can completely understand, and we, really want to make it clear that once you see this bigger picture, part of where we're different from most environmental organizations is that we're not saying, be the change you want to see in the world. We're not saying that you as an individual, by choosing to leave your job and become a gardener, that you're going to be this important change. We're saying that to make the changes we need to make, we need to come together to change the I to a we. And we would urge people who have a decent job, where they're not, creating nuclear bombs or, toxic chemicals to poison people, whatever their job might be, it might be worthwhile to hold on to that, but to just liberate your mind and maybe liberate a little bit of your time by not being on the fast job track and realizing that that end post isn't going to be very satisfying. So it can be a step-by-step way of maintaining a certain financial security while opening your mind to the possibility that you can start connecting to inspiring and meaningful changes at the local level, but you can also become a voice for bigger change. I mean, we for instance, there's now a movement for UBI, Universal Basic Income. We feel that without any understanding, again, of the systemic processes going on, is not particularly desirable. What would be fabulous would be to have universal basic income as part of a systemic change that starts changing this path of wider and wider gap between rich and poor and global giants that are unaccountable, invisible, non-regulated. As we start bringing the economy home in this process of transition, to have UBI could be wonderful. But again, it'd be, really important if you can liberate your mind and make a little bit of an effort to carve out enough time to connect with like-minded individuals. That's one of the first things. And ideally they will be near where you are, so you can actually meet face to face. And that's one of the, that's a really healing process and can be very invigorating and energizing. And you can figure out projects where you can help to get the word out. Even if you just send out emails about meaningful books and projects and initiatives, to actually feel that you're part of changing the world. I hope that makes sense. Thank you all so much.
And joining and helping us spread the word about World Localization Day, which is really trying to launch this movement into mainstream thinking.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we'll send you a link to World Localization Day in the email with this recording, so then you can share that with everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.